Power in small towns doesn't always come from politics. It comes from fear. A white gang had been quietly driving out black families across a Georgia suburb using threats, fire, and silence. When they kidnapped a black woman on her morning walk, they thought she'd be another easy win. What they didn't know was that her husband was a former Delta Force commander with a past buried in classified missions. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. By the time they realized who they had crossed, it was too late. They hadn't just taken someone's wife, they'd declared war. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun hung low and warm over the rooftops of Meadowridge, softening the early autumn air as it slipped across neatly trimmed hedges and carefully watered lawns, casting long, amber-tinted shadows that stretched lazily over the sidewalks. It was the kind of neighborhood where the illusion of safety wrapped itself around everything like ivy. Quiet streets, familiar waves, and driveways lined with SUVs and strollers. No one locked their doors during the day, not because crime didn't happen, but because people here believed it happened to someone else, somewhere else, never on their side of the hedge. There was a rhythm to it all, a carefully preserved calm built on knowing glances, subtle boundaries, and a kind of order that left little room for disruption, especially if that disruption didn't look like them. Jasmine King moved through the neighborhood with the ease of someone who had adapted to those rhythms without ever fully belonging to them. Around her wrist, a slim fitness band rested beneath the sleeve of her hoodie, mostly forgotten during these walks, but always active. An old agreement between her and Khalil after a particularly bad neighborhood incident months ago. Her morning walks were something sacred, a brief window of stillness before the day's responsibilities began. The houses passed by in slow succession, each one with its own manicured lawn, flagpole, or decorative porch swing, but none of them ever really felt like home the way hers did. She had made peace with that long ago. Some people pretended this place was perfect. Jasmine only pretended to believe them. As she passed the fourth house on Waverly Lane, she slowed just slightly, casting a subtle glance toward the curb, where a matte black pickup truck sat idle, its engine silent, but its presence loud in its contrast. It bore no dealership plate, no neighborhood parking tag, and no trace of a family attached to it. It wasn't the first time she'd seen it there this week, and although it hadn't moved or done anything to raise alarm on paper, something about it felt out of place, like a shadow stretched a little too far from its source. She didn't stop walking, but her fingers tightened inside her hoodie pocket where her phone rested, the cool metal of its case grounding her in the moment. Her eyes flicked to the tinted driver's side window, where she caught only the faintest glimmer of her reflection before the sun shifted and erased it. Several streets away, in a house that looked like every other from the outside, but was anything but ordinary on the inside, Khalil King moved with quiet precision through the kitchen, his actions efficient and methodical in a way that never fully left him, no matter how many years he'd been out. The scent of brewing coffee filled the space, sharp and comforting, while a low hum from the security console by the side wall provided a familiar backdrop to his routine. He wasn't a man who needed noise. He was a man who noticed when it disappeared. The home was built with layers most people would never see. Reinforced locks, smart wiring, hidden cameras. Yet none of it ever felt excessive. Khalil didn't prepare for war. He prepared for the day someone else started one. He glanced toward the monitor where 6 live feeds from external cameras painted a panoramic view of the property. Everything was in order. Jasmine's GPS signal pulsed steadily from her phone, marking her progress along her usual route. He allowed himself a small breath. Not quite a smile, but close enough. Jasmine never missed her walks. They were her way of staying balanced, rooted, unbothered by the slow crawl of daily chaos. He trusted her instincts, but that didn't mean he ever stopped watching. Jasmine reached the dog park near the cul-de-sac, where a woman with short blonde hair and too much perfume offered a familiar wave, the kind that carried more social obligation than actual friendliness. Jasmine returned the gesture with a nod, her steps never breaking rhythm as she followed the curve of the sidewalk and approached the far end of the street where the morning always felt quieter. A utility van sat parked at the corner, unmarked and unobtrusive at first glance, positioned beside a rust-stained fire hydrant as if awaiting some forgotten service call. One man occupied the driver's seat, head bent down, posture still. Another stood near the rear doors, adjusting something mounted on a pole. Perhaps a scanner or survey tool, though Jasmine couldn't see clearly enough to tell. What struck her wasn't what they were doing, but how still everything else around them had become. She didn't stop walking, but her pace slowed by a fraction. Her body language relaxed even as her awareness sharpened. She was too experienced to react openly to the sensation that bloomed slowly in her chest. The vague pressure that something wasn't quite right. She passed them, head turned slightly forward, though her peripheral vision caught the man at the back, lowering the pole and glancing toward her. Their eyes met, and he offered a smile. Quick, practiced, and utterly wrong. She nodded once and kept walking, stepping onto the trail that curved behind the park. The shortcut trimmed 5 minutes off her loop and was usually deserted at this hour. She hesitated at the edge of it, her heel pausing mid-step. There was no one ahead. No dogs, no joggers. Only the rustling of leaves overhead and the faint sound of the van's engine, now reduced to a distant idle. Somewhere nearby, gravel shifted, just a whisper. But it was enough. Before she could turn fully, a hand grabbed her shoulder, another clamped down over her mouth, and a heavy canvas hood dropped over her head. The attack was swift and methodical, every movement calculated to silence and disorient. She struggled, kicking and twisting as her breath caught in her throat, but they were strong and efficient, trained not for chaos, but for extraction. Her body was forced forward, her hands wrenched behind her back, the scent of sweat and leather closing in around her. A sharp jab to her ribs stole her air, and the last thing she heard before the world turned silent was a voice whispering directly into her ear. Calm, practiced, and disturbingly familiar. Keep still. This isn't about you. Just blocks away, in the quiet hum of his security-filled study, Khalil's eyes were locked on the same monitor he had checked only minutes earlier. The blinking dot that marked his wife's progress had vanished from the screen in the space of a heartbeat. No signal, no alert, just absence. At first, he didn't react. He blinked once, leaned slightly forward, and refreshed the page, expecting the signal to reappear with the minor delay that sometimes occurred when the device moved out of range or momentarily disconnected from the satellite. He had seen it before, usually when Jasmine took the path through the wooded shortcut behind the park, where coverage had occasional blind spots due to the elevation and dense tree cover. It had happened before, rarely, but this didn't feel like one of those drops. This wasn't random. It was too clean, too sudden. He refreshed again. Still nothing. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled lightly beneath his chin, eyes narrowing just a touch. He didn't move from the desk immediately, didn't race out the door like some panicked husband in a movie, because Khalil didn't operate from emotion until emotion had earned its place. He studied the timestamp. Signal loss recorded at 7:43 a.m. It was now 7:46. 3 minutes. Inconclusive. He pulled up the GPS history and traced her last known location. watching the pale blue line map her usual route, uninterrupted, right up to the trail's entrance. The cutoff point was sharp, clean, like a blade had sliced through the feed and left nothing behind. That, in itself, was unusual. Typically, the system logged fluctuations or gradual loss. This was abrupt, surgical. But even then, Khalil refused to assign meaning without evidence. He didn't like ghosts. He preferred facts. By 8:02, he was standing in the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear as he dialed her directly. It rang. Once, twice. Then went to voicemail. He waited exactly 1 minute, then called again. Same result. This time, he left a message, calm and measured, his voice giving nothing away. Jazz, it's me. Your signal dropped a little while ago. Probably nothing. But give me a call when you get this. By 8:25, he had tried a third time, then switched tactics, pinging the emergency tracker embedded in her fitness band, a backup feature they had agreed upon but rarely used. It returned no response. He stared at the data screen longer than necessary, running the numbers through his head like a field equation. It had been nearly 45 minutes since the last location ping. The average length of her walk was 42 minutes from door to door, give or take 2 minutes depending on whether she stopped to talk with someone or lingered at the park. She hadn't yet returned. She hadn't called. Her signal was gone. Her backup tracker was offline. The pieces began to realign themselves. Khalil moved then, but not in a rush. Every step was deliberate, every movement purposeful. He crossed the house in silence, unlocking a panel disguised as part of the bookshelf and retrieving a compact black case from the recessed compartment behind it. Inside was not just a weapon, but an entire operating framework, tactical tools, encrypted comms, and gear he hadn't touched in nearly 2 years. As he unlatched the lid, a cold certainty settled across his shoulders like armor. Still, he didn't speak. He didn't say it aloud, not even to himself. It was only after 9:01 a.m., more than an hour since the signal vanished, when he returned to the security console and began pulling footage from every angle within a 5-block radius. He cross-referenced street views, doorbell cams, and municipal traffic nodes he wasn't supposed to have access to. He ran an automated plate sweep and queued satellite images logged from the Department of Transportation's relay system. It was an advantage of the life he had lived before, of the quiet access no one thought to revoke. He was supposed to be retired, forgotten, left alone. But whoever had taken Jasmine didn't know who he was. By 9:28, he had eyes on the trailhead. The footage wasn't clear enough to catch the act itself, but it was enough to confirm she had entered. What struck him more was what followed. The utility van. He froze the frame, enhanced it, ran the plate. Nothing came back. No registration. No match. The camera angle caught a blurred reflection in the passenger side mirror. Just a flicker of motion, but enough to show someone exiting the woods and slipping back into the van. Whoever they were, they moved like professionals. No fumbling, no hesitation, no wasted gestures. Not street punks or random thugs. Not opportunists. He narrowed the focus and took a still shot of the driver's profile. It wasn't much, just a jawline, a sliver of the cheek, maybe a patch of ink near the neck, but it was enough for Khalil to start building a face. He pulled from memory, from patterns, from every file he had ever studied about abductions, mercenary tactics, and extraction behavior. By the time the clock edged toward 10, the calm that had once defined his morning was gone. Not broken. Replaced. He didn't allow panic to take root. He didn't allow fear to cloud his vision. He allowed action. He assembled his gear slowly, silently, each motion practiced from years of repetition. Kevlar vest, sidearm, digital scrambler, GPS suppressor, burner phone, encrypted comms chip. He moved through the space like a man preparing for a reconnaissance op in hostile territory. Not because he was overreacting, but because he no longer believed the situation was something benign. As he stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanned the street with a precision that didn't belong in suburban America. He had spent his life walking into shadows other people never knew existed. He had fought in places where the line between ally and enemy shifted every hour. But this wasn't war. Not yet. This was personal. And whoever took Jasmine King had just stepped into a war of their own making. By late morning, Khalil had converted the study into a silent operations center. The overhead lights remained off, replaced by the cool glow of multiple screens casting long, shifting reflections across the dark wood of the desk. Lines of code flickered beside drone imagery. On one monitor, the same frame repeated every few seconds. A van pulling away from the curb, its taillights catching the morning sun like embers before it disappeared around the corner. Another screen displayed a split view of his neighborhood from 6 different angles. All time-stamped and sharpened by enhancement software Khalil had written himself years ago during long nights overseas when rest felt optional and enemies never slept. He sat motionless in his chair, his eyes tracking each movement captured across the array of feeds, his fingers barely brushing the keyboard as he ran background processes in parallel, license plate checks, satellite echo points, signal drift maps. All of it conducted with the silent fluency of a man trained to extract clarity from chaos. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was rebuilding the incident frame by frame, hour by hour, and breath by breath, until it gave him something, anything, he could work with. There was no place for panic in this room. There was only the plan and the inevitability of its execution. The van had been positioned with care, stationed just outside the trailhead exit point for no more than 6 minutes. The footage showed no emblems, no identifiers, nothing that would mark it as a service vehicle or a local delivery truck. Its windows were dark, possibly reinforced, and the paint had a dull, matte finish that told him it had been modified to avoid reflection and detail capture. From a distance, it looked forgettable. But up close, it had been designed to vanish in plain sight. He tracked the van backward through traffic cameras, catching sight of it twice, once before it entered the surveillance dead zone, and again just after it exited. The footage came from a liquor store's camera on the edge of the zone and an ATM at a gas station just outside the final block. The 5-block blackout had been carefully timed, a stretch without residential cams or traffic monitors, likely chosen to cover the abduction itself. There were no visible identifiers on the men who entered and exited it, but Khalil isolated a profile from the ATM feed. A man in his 30s, narrow frame, squared shoulders, a buzzed haircut, and sharp jawline visible through the glare on the lens. The man stood casually beside the passenger side door, smoking with one hand, while his other rested lightly on a metal pipe or baton that hung from his belt in a loose loop. His posture didn't suggest nervousness or improvisation. He stood like someone who knew his timing, who knew the environment, and more importantly, who had done this before. Khalil ran facial reconstruction through private archives, feeding the image into a system no longer connected to official networks. He bypassed the government databases. He didn't trust them. Instead, he used a private deep scan tool maintained by a handful of former Black Ops operatives like himself, people who knew that ghosts didn't show up in official records, only in the shadows of old missions and places forgotten by everyone but the dead. While the scan progressed, Khalil opened a second file system and pulled up topographical overlays of the surrounding area. His eyes moved slowly across the grid until they landed on a cluster of abandoned freight facilities along the eastern perimeter of the town, warehouses once used for transport logistics before the rail line was decommissioned a decade ago. They had sat untouched for years, and as far as most people were concerned, The buildings had no current use. But he remembered something else. An old mission report from a neighboring county involving arms shipments, a laundering front disguised as a scrapyard, and rumors of militia groups using similar terrain as staging grounds. It had been dismissed at the time. Not enough proof. No jurisdiction. Still, he remembered the layout, the choke points, and most importantly, the way the surveillance dead zones lined up too perfectly with the current route the van had taken. No traffic cameras, no toll stations, no residential footage for 5 consecutive blocks. The signal loss wasn't accidental. They had planned this route long before today. He saved the GPS coordinates, uploaded them to a secure satellite tracker, and fed the location into a burner device linked to a portable drone unit housed in the garage. It would give him a live feed within the hour. Until then, he needed a second layer of confirmation, something that connected the van and its occupants to a broader movement. These weren't independent actors. Their training, their timing, their precision, it all pointed to something larger, something organized. And if that was the case, then it was no longer just a rescue mission. It was a dismantling. Miles away, in a room stripped of comfort and deliberately deprived of identity, Jasmine sat still in the chair where they had left her. Her wrists were zip-tied to the metal frame behind her back, the cold of the floor seeping through the soles of her shoes, her ankles cinched tightly enough to prevent motion, but not so much as to cut circulation. The room was barely lit, a single bulb swinging lazily from a wire, casting fractured shadows against wooden crates, rusted chains, and crates marked with half-torn barcodes and faded paint. The walls were unfinished, lined with insulation and rot-stained paneling. This wasn't a basement. It was a storage room. Temporary. Clean enough to avoid infection, dirty enough to be disposable. Her breathing remained controlled, shallow but steady. Her body slouched forward in a way that gave the appearance of disorientation. But her mind was sharp. She had counted the number of steps from the van to the room. She had noted the echo pattern in the hallway outside and memorized the sequence of mechanical sounds from what she suspected was an old freight door locking mechanism. She knew 2 men were present at all times, and that a third one, the man who had spoken to her during the abduction, moved differently, without sound, without scent, without wasted motion. She closed her eyes briefly and replayed his words. "Keep still. This isn't about you." He had whispered it with the practiced ease of someone who meant it, but Jasmine didn't believe him. Everything was about something, and if they had gone to this much trouble to take her alive, then she wasn't just a warning. She was leverage, information, bait. And if she was bait, then Khalil was the target. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes lifting to the far corner of the room where a blacked-out camera lens blinked once every few seconds, steady and methodical. They were watching her, and she intended to let them. Let them think she was breaking down. Let them believe she was already weakened. She had learned a long time ago that silence was its own kind of power. And she knew Khalil, knew how he moved, how he thought, how he counted the angles long before anyone else even saw the board. He was coming. Of that, she had no doubt. All she had to do now was stay alive long enough to meet him halfway. Across town, the rusted gates of a forgotten storage yard groaned under the force of Khalil's hand as he pushed them open just enough to slide through. The sun had begun its descent, casting long streaks of orange across the tops of the containers stacked 2, 3 high, arranged like a maze with no clear path, no signage, no reason for anyone to be there unless they knew what to look for. He moved like a shadow, dressed in charcoal-gray fatigues that blended into the industrial gloom. A low-slung satchel hugged his side, one hand resting on the grip of a suppressed sidearm, his eyes scanning the layout without pause. The data had pointed him here. intermittent heat signatures, scrubbed logistics records, and a fragment of cell phone metadata pinging from the burner network he had hacked only hours earlier. The van hadn't returned, but someone connected to the operation had. He knew that kind of sloppiness didn't happen by accident. It happened when people believed they were invincible. They were about to learn otherwise. He crept past the edge of the stacked containers, eyes narrowing at a half-open roll-up door flickering under the stuttering light of an overhead bulb. Voices echoed faintly inside. Male, low, unguarded. There were no sentries, no external cameras, no signs of organized defense, and that, more than anything, confirmed his suspicion. These men weren't expecting retaliation. They believed no one would come looking for a missing black woman. Not here. Not in this town. And certainly not from a husband who, in their minds, was just another civilian. Khalil stepped through the threshold with his weapon raised, his footfalls soft but deliberate. The two men inside never had time to shout. The first dropped with a sharp gasp, the butt of the pistol slamming into the bridge of his nose before he could reach for the weapon tucked under his coat. The second turned just fast enough to see Khalil's eyes before his legs were swept out from under him, the breath driven from his lungs with a single blow to the chest. Khalil knelt beside him, pressing the gun to the man's neck, his voice low, steady, and without rage. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for what you're protecting." The man's mouth opened, but Khalil didn't wait. He stripped the phone from the man's jacket, tossed a pair of flex cuffs around his wrists, and left him face down in the dirt. He'd wasted enough time. He needed intel. He needed names. And now he had a device. Cheap, unbranded, encrypted, but poorly secured. He walked out just as calmly as he had entered. By the time he returned to his SUV, parked several blocks away beneath the cover of dusk, the phone had already yielded something interesting. There were no contact names, no call logs, and only one active app. A secure messaging program shielded by a biometric lock that had, fortunately, not been disabled by the unconscious guard's still warm fingerprint. Inside, Khalil found messages written in code, threads that didn't resemble gang slang or drug exchanges, but operational commands. Asset moved. Route B confirmed. Extraction complete. Next target under review. He stared at the screen, the words flat and precise, military in tone. This wasn't just a crew of thugs snatching people off the street for ransom or threats. This was organized, methodical, and the phrase "next target" struck a chord deep in his chest that hadn't stirred since his last classified op overseas. He saved the messages, encrypted the file, and burned the original SIM with a lighter flame until the casing cracked. He had what he needed, for now. Inside the storage facility, Jasmine's captors had changed shifts. The younger one, the one with nervous eyes and too many questions, had taken a position near the door, while the older one stepped outside to smoke. She watched the younger one carefully, her breath still slow, her posture unchanged. But when he moved closer to the table and muttered something under his breath, her eyes flicked toward him just long enough to make him notice. "You got a name?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. He looked surprised. He hadn't expected her to speak. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not supposed to talk. But you want to," she said, her voice softer now, tilted just enough to feel disarming. "You're not like the others," he scoffed, but she caught the shift in his stance, the doubt. "They don't tell you everything, do they?" she continued. "They say it's about making the town safe, cleaning up the streets, keeping order. But then it's not just homes anymore. It's schools, it's churches, it's women." He didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. "I know why you're here," she whispered. "Because someone told you if you didn't join them, you'd be next." A long silence followed. Outside, the man known as Red leaned against the wall. watching the building's entrance through narrowed eyes. He hadn't said much since the abduction. He hadn't needed to. He operated like a blade drawn halfway from the sheath, always just short of violence, always ready. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the glow sharp in the twilight, and exhaled slow. He had seen women like her before, smart, too clever for their own good, the kind who thought they could bend men with nothing but words. She was dangerous, not because she was loud, but because she was patient. Red flicked the cigarette into the dirt and stepped back inside. Elsewhere, under a thick veil of official indifference, Khalil sat in the sheriff's office across from a man who wore his badge like a family heirloom and his authority like a shield. Sheriff Beck didn't flinch as Khalil laid a printed photo of the van on the desk. "That's your business," Beck said casually, leaning back with a slow breath. "But we don't have anything on that plate. And, unless you've got evidence of a crime committed in this jurisdiction, I'd appreciate you leaving the investigation to those of us wearing the star." Khalil's expression didn't change. He simply stood, collected the photo, and slid it back into the file. "You already know what happened," he said quietly. "You just think if you ignore it long enough, it'll go away." Sheriff Beck smiled, thin, practiced, patronizing. "You be careful, Mr. King. Not everything in this town needs a hero." Khalil didn't answer. He didn't need to. The conversation with Sheriff Beck echoed in Khalil's mind long after he left the office. Not because anything new had been said, but because of the way it had been delivered. Measured, dismissive, just smooth enough to hide the truth in plain sight. Beck hadn't asked for details, hadn't leaned forward, hadn't pretended to care. There had been no curiosity, no urgency, just that familiar air of men who believed time itself would fold around them in deference. It told Khalil one thing: Beck already knew. Or worse, Beck was complicit. He stepped into his vehicle and closed the door slowly, letting the sound seal him in. Outside, the sheriff's office continued with its quiet, unbothered rhythm. Inside, Khalil was already halfway through deconstructing the layers beneath it. He didn't need to chase the man. Beck would reveal himself in time. The real question now was who had placed the infrastructure beneath him? Who had the reach, the coordination, and the confidence to operate in broad daylight under the illusion of law and order? Back at his temporary command post, Khalil transferred the encrypted messages he'd extracted from the gang phone into his secure laptop. He filtered them through a language algorithm, cross-referencing military code books, black market shorthand, and cartel-based ciphers. What emerged wasn't a conversation. It was a chain of commands, timed and structured. The phone hadn't just been used for communication. It had been part of a system. Nodes triggering location pings, automated check-ins, and pre-programmed tasks. It was designed not just to follow orders, but to track compliance. One command stood out: Asset King active. Phase 1 confirmed. The phrasing sent a cold wave down his spine. He read it again, slowly, the words seeming to curl at the edges, familiar in a way he couldn't place, like a voice heard once in a dream and remembered years later in a moment of silence. Asset King. He stared at the screen longer than he meant to, his fingers stilling on the keyboard. He opened a different folder, an archived set of classified mission logs that hadn't been touched in nearly 6 years. The operation had been domestic, buried under several layers of compartmentalization, and labeled in vague terms about strategic containment and interstate stabilization efforts. At the time, it hadn't made sense. He'd asked questions. Most were never answered. But now, in the coded structure of those messages, something was rising from the fog. The messages referred to something called Purity Line. He ran the name through his intelligence crawlers. At first, nothing surfaced, just the usual political bait, web chatter, and false positives. But in a suppressed forum once used to track domestic terror threats, he found a dormant thread dated 18 months prior. It contained only one image, a circular insignia of interlocked arrows overlaid on a black and red shield. The caption read, "Purity line confirmed. Intel blackout ordered." Khalil sat motionless, eyes locked on the screen. The symbol matched one he'd seen stitched into a mission patch back in 2016. Barely a glimpse, worn by a civilian contractor during a joint operation in Colorado. He remembered thinking it was unusual, something out of place. He'd asked about it. The handler had brushed it off, saying it was project-specific and not for team review. He hadn't pushed it then. He had accepted that things above his clearance existed. But now, years later, it was staring back at him. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was a coordinated movement. And for some reason, he was already written into it. Elsewhere, in the cold silence of the storage room, Jasmine stirred gently in her chair. Her limbs ached from the tension of stillness, but she didn't move with desperation. She shifted with purpose, just enough to draw the attention of the younger guard who had begun pacing again, his nerves building in the vacuum of unanswered orders. His partner, the one she called Red in her mind, hadn't spoken to her directly. He watched instead, hovered just beyond the doorway, only stepping in when she grew too quiet for too long. He was the threat, the real one. But the other man, he was uncertain. She could feel it in the way he glanced toward the hallway whenever Red left, in the way he hesitated before tightening the zip ties that morning, in the way his gaze dropped each time she met his eyes. He hadn't signed up for this. Not completely. And she intended to exploit that fracture. "You have a sister?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the stillness like a thread pulled taut. The guard froze, halfway through another step. "What?" he replied, startled, not by the question, but by the fact that she had broken the silence. "A sister," she repeated, her head tilting toward him with careful slowness. "Someone younger. Someone you swore you'd always protect." He didn't answer immediately, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. "Don't," he said after a beat, his voice thin, uneven. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jasmine said, her voice low but even. "But you know this isn't about law and order. It's not about protecting anything. It's about fear, control. And sooner or later, they'll turn it on you, too." The guard swallowed hard, but didn't move away, didn't threaten. He just stood there, caught between belief and doubt, between loyalty and conscience. From the hallway, Red's voice cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. "Step outside." The guard blinked, startled, then exited quickly, brushing past Red without eye contact. Red entered the room and stood just inside the door, arms crossed, his posture casual but loaded with intent. "You think this is a game," he said, his voice like gravel dragged across stone. "But we've dealt with louder mouths than yours." Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply met his stare and held it. "I'm not loud," she said. "I'm just patient." Red smiled faintly. It didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see." Back at the safe house, Khalil leaned over his equipment, piecing together threads of data that no longer pointed in circles. The coded language, the silence from law enforcement, the forgotten patch, the phrase, "Asset King." Someone wasn't just targeting Jasmine. Someone was monitoring him. This entire operation, the abduction, the silence, the misdirection, was built around the assumption that he would respond, that he would come, that he would chase. The more he traced it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just personal. It was planned. The rusted gate of the rail yard screeched as it gave way to Khalil's slow, deliberate push, the sound swallowed by the emptiness stretching out across the gravel lot beyond. This place had been forgotten by most of the town, a grid of derelict containers and collapsed structures that once moved goods across the state, but now sat hollow and quiet beneath a darkening sky. He didn't need anyone watching this. What was about to happen didn't require witnesses. He moved with the fluid caution of a man who understood terrain, weaving between stacks of oxidized steel and twisted fencing, his eyes fixed on the trail he'd been tracking for hours. A white SUV sat wedged between two containers near the edge of the yard, engine still warm, a soft click marking the recent shutdown. The license matched the one that had shadowed the van out of town. The vehicle wasn't just tailing them, it was coordinating. That meant whoever sat behind the wheel wasn't just a pawn. They were part of it. Khalil advanced with no hesitation, his silhouette folding into the shadows, cast by the slats of moonlight breaking through the broken canopy. He reached the driver's side just as the door creaked open, catching the figure mid-exit. Tall, lean, white, maybe late 30s, with a dark tactical jacket and a shoulder rig already half-drawn. Khalil didn't speak. He struck. The first blow caught the man across the temple, snapping his head sideways into the door frame. The pistol clattered to the ground, but he recovered quickly, swinging wildly with a clenched fist that Khalil ducked beneath, driving his elbow hard into the man's ribs. The man staggered, gasped, then launched into a grapple, military training evident in his footwork, the pivot of his hips, the shortness of his reach. This wasn't street fighting. This was conditioning. But Khalil had lived through worse. The fight dragged across the gravel, brutal and fast, both men trading blows without pause. The man, Cal, as Khalil would soon learn, landed a glancing strike to the side of Khalil's face, opening a shallow cut above his brow. It barely registered. Khalil slammed his knee into Cal's thigh, spinning him toward the SUV and driving his head into the rear panel with enough force to leave a dent. Cal dropped to one knee, breath hitching, arms raised in a desperate block. But Khalil was already on him, hooking one arm, wrenching it backward until Cal shouted, the shoulder dislocating with a sickening pop. The scream cut the silence of the yard like glass. "You follow the van," Khalil growled, his forearm pressing into Cal's throat as he pinned him against the ground, the gravel grinding into skin. "Why?" Cal choked, jaw clenched tight, blood running from the corner of his mouth. He didn't answer. Khalil twisted the arm harder, shifting his weight just enough to force the pain into something white-hot and unbearable. Cal's body arched. "I'm not asking twice." "Back off," Cal rasped, voice breaking. "I'm not the one who grabbed her." "You're with them," Khalil said, his voice calm but coiled with menace. "That's enough." "I was just the tracker," Cal spat, gasping as Khalil released a fraction of pressure. "Surveillance. Relay. I swear." Khalil dragged him up by the collar and shoved him against the side of the SUV, eyes locked on his. "Then you know where they took her." Cal hesitated, breathing ragged. Khalil slammed him again, the side of his skull hitting metal with a sharp thud. "Quarry Road," Cal gasped. "North Side compound. She's probably there." Khalil froze, his eyes narrowing. "Compound?" Cal nodded, eyes squinting against the pain, sweat now pouring down his face. "They don't keep people in the open. That place, the Hollow, they move them there for processing, vetting. People disappear in there. And you deliver them?" "No," Cal groaned. "I report. They give the orders. Everything's coded. Everything." Khalil reached into the man's jacket, retrieved a rugged phone from an inner pouch, and flipped it open. The device buzzed once, encrypted. He shoved it into his own pack, then stepped back, breathing hard, the cut on his brow now dripping down the side of his face. "You're going to tell me about the Hollow," Khalil said, stepping forward again, voice low and final. And you're going to tell me what Purity Line is? Cal froze when he heard the name. His eyes, wide, shaken now, searched Khalil's for something, anything that might explain how he knew it. You shouldn't know that, he whispered. But I do, Khalil answered. So talk. Cal's body sagged against the SUV, his dislocated arm trembling with every breath. You were in the files, he said finally. Asset King. Phase 1. They knew you'd come. They planned for it. You were the variable they built the program around. She wasn't the target. You were. Khalil didn't speak. He simply stared at the man as the blood throbbed behind his eyes. Cal continued, his words broken now, forced out one at a time under the weight of his own pain. Everything you've done since the abduction, every move, you weren't uncovering anything. You were following a trail they set. And that's when it hit Khalil. Not as a suspicion, but as an anchored truth. He wasn't just hunting them. They had wanted him to. They had been watching him long before Jasmine vanished. And now, the trail didn't lead to an answer. It led to a trap. The air inside the safe house had turned still, heavy with the kind of quiet that doesn't offer peace, but instead invites revelation. Khalil stood motionless before the array of screens lining the wall, his eyes locked on the server he had just breached. The flickering lines of code slowly translating into structured folders, each stamped with a seal that didn't belong to any public database, each more unsettling than the last. At first, he thought he'd found only intel left behind by the men who took Jasmine. But what appeared on the screen now felt different. It wasn't random. It wasn't a trail someone forgot to scrub. It was waiting for him. The folders were nested deep within a shell company tied to a technology firm based out of Northern Virginia. Harmless in appearance, no public contracts, no press releases, just vague corporate speak about predictive analytics for urban revitalization. But Khalil recognized the defense contractor's true name, buried in the source code. He had heard it before, once, in a debriefing during his final months in uniform. A firm that had worked with DARPA on neural mapping and urban behavioral forecasting. Their projects were always ghosted, plausible deniability, no press, no paper trails. And now, somehow, this firm was linked to real estate deeds, development grants, and forced property transfers scattered across the town Khalil had tried to make his home. He clicked through one folder labeled Regional Optimization Phase 2. Inside were maps, parcel overlays, ownership histories. Every one of them had something in common. Each property had once belonged to a black family. Each one had changed hands after a civil disruption, some due to arrests, some due to fires, some following disappearances that no one had ever truly explained. At the center of each cluster, cross-referenced through zoning board minutes and quiet shell corporations, were names Khalil recognized. Contractors he had crossed paths with in other parts of the country, always lingering around projects that were never finished, but always profitable. It wasn't about rebuilding. It was about removing, displacing, strategically clearing populations under the guise of redevelopment. And at the bottom of the page, in bold letters stamped across a secure encrypted file, were two characters that made Khalil's throat tighten. KK, his initials. He stared at them, unmoving, the cursor blinking like a slow heartbeat beneath the words, Asset King, Alpha Tier. He opened the file. Inside were surveillance photos, his home, his routines, street angles of Jasmine walking the neighborhood. Time-stamped logs followed them for months. Satellite footage tracked his SUV along roads he hadn't thought twice about. Audio recordings, tagged and labeled, captured him speaking on the phone to old colleagues. Even photos from overseas, old operations, long buried, had been pulled into the system. Every piece of his life catalogued. Not from the outside, but from within, from someone who knew what to look for. He hadn't uncovered the plan. He had walked directly into it. This entire thing, the abduction, the encrypted phones, even the staged resistance from the sheriff's office, had been constructed to provoke him, to wake something in him that they had buried years ago. It hadn't just been about taking Jasmine. It had been about reactivating him. He stepped back from the desk, hands trembling, not with fear, but with the kind of realization that turns the floor beneath your feet into something uncertain. They didn't just want to see what he'd do. They wanted to record it. And as he stood there, heart thudding against his ribs, he began to question everything that had come before. The missed alerts, the clean drop-off of the van's location, the ease with which Cal broke. None of it was coincidence. It was design, calculated exposure. He was being guided like a tool retraced back to the source that built him. And somewhere inside that source was the answer to why. Not just why Jasmine was taken, but why she was marked. The connection came like a thread pulled tight through memory. Jasmine had been working on a local investigative report, a zoning scandal tied to redevelopment money. She'd mentioned it in passing, called it a deep well of nonsense, and moved on, as she often did when something felt too ugly to give power to. But now, Khalil saw it for what it was. She had gotten too close. Not to just some real estate scam, but to this. The shell firm, the property seizures, the names. And by getting too close, she had exposed herself. And, by extension, him. In the corner of the safe house, his burner phone lit up. A message blinked across the screen from a trusted contact who had been tracing satellite traffic in the background. Purity Line. Operational network under Project Eden. 17 nodes confirmed. You're Node 1. Node 1. They hadn't just been watching him. They had built the model around him. Miles away, inside the walls of the hollow, Jasmine pressed her palm against the edge of the cold metal cot as she twisted her wrist again, slowly working the jagged shard she had hidden beneath the cuff of her jeans into position. The guard rotation had changed. The room was darker now, quieter. She could still hear voices outside the corridor, Red among them, giving orders in clipped tones, but they had relaxed in posture. They believed the transfer was hours away, that she was broken, that Khalil hadn't found them yet. She closed her eyes and counted to 3. Then she moved. The shard bit through the plastic zip tie at her ankle with a slow, scraping tension. It snapped clean. Her leg jerked slightly, but she held steady. One wrong move, and she'd lose the tool. She had one chance. Her hands were still bound behind her, but her legs were free now. She adjusted her balance, shifted her weight, and waited. Red would come again. He always did just before they moved her. It was his pattern, his ritual, showing up to remind her who had power before handing her over to the next link in their chain. But this time, she wouldn't be sitting silent, playing the part they'd written for her. When that door opened, she would be ready. Back in the safe house, Khalil sat still before the screen, its pale glow casting long shadows across his face. The final message etched into his mind like a scar he hadn't realized he was still carrying. Node 1. Asset King. These weren't just titles. They were blueprints, a designation, a claim on his very identity, drafted and filed by people who believed they could use him like a weapon waiting on a shelf. He had thought he was dismantling their operation, but this wasn't a rescue anymore. This was a reckoning, and they had no idea what they had reawakened. The room was dim now, lit only by the rhythm of the monitors casting slow pulses of light against the concrete walls. But Khalil hadn't moved in nearly an hour. He stood before the center screen, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his body rigid, not in readiness, but in something heavier, something colder. What stared back at him wasn't a tactical file. It was a timeline, a digital portrait of his life, spanning nearly a decade, catalogued with the precision of a surveillance program designed to track every movement, every stop, every contact. At first, the photos had seemed random. Overhead shots from foreign deployments, blurry images from base entries, satellite captures of intersections he'd forgotten he'd crossed. But the deeper he clicked, the more impossible it became to ignore. These weren't mission archives. These weren't gathered by enemies. These were his. Moments no one else should have had access to. Him walking through a secure compound in Jordan, standing outside a medical tent in Al-Hasaka, boarding a nondescript vehicle in Ankara under the cover of night. Missions that had been classified even to those who served beside him. Images he had never seen before, never approved, never expected to resurface. And yet, here they were, time-stamped and arranged like pieces of a profile. One he hadn't built, but one that had been constructed around him nonetheless. He scrolled further and found the earliest ones, grainy, years old. A security camera from a highway toll booth outside Atlanta. Another from a gas station in Tennessee. Then from a church parking lot in Missouri. He wasn't even active then. He had been trying to live a life, trying to be someone else. But someone had still been watching, tracking every transition, every place he'd stopped to breathe. The pit in his stomach turned to stone as he opened the next folder and saw the field diagrams, tactical grids matching gang assault patterns to known paramilitary tactics. Breach points, containment sweeps, use of false alarms, staggered communication intervals to delay law enforcement response. It wasn't just familiar, it was identical. They had copied tactics from black operations, from him, or worse. He had trained them. Khalil stepped back from the screen, his hand instinctively rising to his temple. It wasn't a headache. It was a memory trying to surface, something buried, fogged over. A mission brief from years ago that didn't fit with the rest. A training contract. A non-combat consultancy. A favor for someone from the inside who said it would be short, routine, anonymous. He had taught a weekend course to a private group on rural combat defense. Hadn't even signed his real name. He'd chalked it up as a one-off, a paycheck to fund his return home. But now he remembered the instructor who'd watched him closely. The tall man in plain clothes with pale eyes who never asked questions during the lesson but wrote constantly. His name had never come up again. Until now. Until Red. He sank into the chair beside the console, his breathing shallow, the silence inside the room deafening. Every mission, every operation, every tactic he thought he'd locked behind the door of the past was now being used to dismantle families that looked like his, to terrorize people who couldn't fight back, and to tear apart the only thing that had ever brought him peace. He wasn't just chasing the enemy. He had given them the tools, and the more he traced it back, the less certain he became that he had ever left that world behind. At that same moment, miles away inside the hollow, Jasmine sat with her legs pressed tight beneath her, the restraints gone from her ankles now, but her wrists still bound. She kept the shard hidden beneath the folded hem of her pant leg, and her breathing steady despite the pressure building behind her ribs. The guards had grown careless again. The rotation between shifts had changed. The pattern no longer held. That told her one thing. Whoever was running this had started to feel nervous. They knew Khalil was getting close. She stared at the wall where the camera had once blinked every few seconds. It was dark now. Either shut off or moved. That was new. They didn't want her to see them anymore. But they still watched. She could feel it in the air, like heat radiating from a corner you couldn't look into. Her legs were free, finally, but her hands remained tied behind her, circulation intact but growing strained. She pressed them together slowly, as if in prayer, knowing she'd only get one more shot before they moved her. Khalil had always moved like the world around him needed to be measured before it could be trusted. He didn't act unless he understood the terrain. But lately, she'd seen something shifting in him. Not fear, guilt, something deeper, something heavier. He had started to look over his shoulder longer, stay quiet longer. His silence wasn't tactical anymore. It was wounded, and that terrified her more than the men outside the door, because she needed him whole. She needed him to remember that whatever they'd taken from him in the years before her, they hadn't taken his purpose. She could only hold the line for so long, and if he started unraveling now, they would both be lost. She didn't know the names, didn't know what purity line was, or why they were labeled, or how long they had been followed. But she knew the way a system moved when it targeted something not just to destroy, but to recruit. This wasn't about hate. It was about harnessing something dangerous. And Khalil was dangerous. Back in the safe house, he sat alone, fists clenched, the hum of the monitors surrounding him like static in his ears. The timeline had caught up to him. The surveillance wasn't past tense anymore. He wasn't looking into what had been done. He was looking at what they expected him to do next. And in the corner of the screen, a new file loaded, marked with a timestamp only minutes old. An image of him, captured from a traffic cam 2 blocks from the compound. They weren't trying to avoid him. They were tracking his every move. The coordinates hadn't come from a satellite trace or a government back channel. They'd come from something far more analog, a single detail buried in a seemingly irrelevant image taken during Cal's surveillance days. Khalil had stared at it for hours without seeing it, until the light hit the screen just right, and he noticed the watermark on a plastic-wrapped pallet in the background of one photo. The faded black stencil read, "Croswell Timber and Aggregate," a defunct supply yard decommissioned almost 9 years ago after the company was fined for illegal waste dumping. The land had been listed for public auction 3 times, but never purchased on record. He found the property listed under a maintenance holding firm in Delaware. No business filings, no employees. But when Khalil overlaid that location with the drone recon data he had been compiling, something clicked. Heat signatures in the center of a vast woodland, old freight access roads still intact. A helipad-sized clearing with a soil pattern suggesting recent excavation. It wasn't marked on civilian maps. The satellite footage was blurred, automatically redacted. That only ever happened when someone wanted it that way. It was the Hollow. He moved before nightfall. His approach was silent, a return to a version of himself he hadn't called on in years. No car, no drone, just his body, a suppressed weapon, and the landscape he read like a battlefield. The perimeter was deceptively loose. No guards visible, just motion sensors buried in a triple-line arc. The kind designed not to alert, but to log intrusions and study patterns. They hadn't fortified it like a fortress. They'd protected it like a lab. He bypassed the sensors with a hand-built signal disruptor, crawling through the underbrush, watching as 2 guards passed within 20 feet of him without noticing the shift in air around them. The building itself was sunken, built into a slope and disguised beneath camouflage netting and lumber piles. Industrial at first glance, but Khalil spotted the ventilation systems designed for underground extension, the seamless concrete path poured recently, and the faint glow of motion-triggered lights through narrow slats. He found a back entry, unlocked, probably assumed too remote for use. He slipped inside. The air shifted instantly, cool, sterilized, humming with electricity. This was not a storage site. This was an intelligence hub. A corridor opened into what looked like an IT center crossed with a tactical command post. Racks of servers stood in rows, hard drives blinking silently, their fans whispering like breath in a tomb. Screens displayed maps, faces, names, dotted clusters across the state, maybe the country. Digital pins over majority black neighborhoods, over towns undergoing redevelopment, over locations he had once passed through without a second thought. Khalil moved deeper. One workstation sat slightly apart, its monitor unlocked, cursor blinking. On screen, Operation Shadowline. Active. His heart slowed, then climbed. He scrolled. The first page bore his photo, military ID, service years, special operations record, all accurate. Beneath it, a field marked Cognitive Reactivation, Probability, 98.3%. Another page listed Jasmine as Relational Catalyst, Tier A. She wasn't just leverage, she was part of their model. A trigger, the reason they knew he would come. He leaned closer, scanning the mission breakdown, and saw what chilled him more than the designation. His own name, King Khalil, listed not as a threat, but as a test platform. They had designed the entire event, not just to trap him, but to watch him awaken. This wasn't revenge. This was research. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Khalil snapped back into motion, downloading the files to his encrypted drive, then setting a timed loop on the server. A silent data wipe set to trigger after 2 minutes of inactivity. He moved toward the exit, pulse hammering behind his ribs, following the path marked Transfer Bay Alpha on the digital schematic he'd memorized seconds earlier. The corridor narrowed, turned sharp twice, then opened into a large, cold room lit by fluorescence and humming with the low whine of machinery. Jasmine stood at the center, zip-tied to a rolling gurney, surrounded by 2 armed men and a technician speaking quietly into a headset. She looked calm, but her eyes locked on Khalil the moment he entered. And in that fraction of a second, everything in her changed. Her posture shifted, her shoulders tensed. She knew. Khalil moved. The first shot dropped the tech. The next 2 tore through the first guard's shoulder and thigh, spinning him to the ground before he could even raise his rifle. The last gunman fired wildly, bullets ricocheting off steel as Khalil closed the distance, dropped low, and struck the man's legs from beneath him. He didn't hesitate. 3 hits, throat, ribs, temple, and the man dropped, unconscious, before his weapon hit the floor. Khalil rushed to Jasmine, cutting through her restraints with a blade drawn from his vest. Her wrists were raw, but she didn't flinch. "You came," she said, voice low, steady despite the chaos around them. "You didn't think I would?" he asked, helping her to her feet. "I knew you would. I just didn't know how much of you would still be left." That stopped him, just for a breath. Then footsteps pounded in the hallway. No time. They moved. Together, they slipped through the loading door into the hallway beyond, Khalil guiding her with one hand and firing with the other, moving like he had in Fallujah, in Kandahar, in all the places he had promised himself he'd never revisit. The path bent and twisted, but he'd memorized the map. He didn't hesitate. The compound shook with alarms as automated locks began to seal the doors. The hallway stretched before them, narrow and windowless, lit with the dull pulse of emergency lights flickering red along the baseboards. Jasmine kept pace beside him, her breath sharp in her throat, wrists still raw, steps uneven. Behind them, the sound of boots pounded through the steel and concrete. Fast, coordinated, closing in. They turned the corner, and the first wave hit. 3 guards emerged from a side corridor, rifles raised. Khalil fired instinctively, but they were too close now. The corridor was too narrow, and the flash of muzzles sparked chaos into a space already collapsing under noise. One guard tackled Khalil sideways into the wall. the two of them crashing against a bolted panel with a guttural thud. The rifle was torn from his grip, and the world tightened into fists, elbows, knees. The man was trained, quick, tight stance, closed fists moving with tactical precision. But Khalil had fought men who moved faster and hit harder. He absorbed the first 3 blows to his ribs, his left arm caught between them, then pivoted low, driving his shoulder into the man's stomach. They crashed to the floor, grappling in a tangle of limbs, the guard's elbow ramming into Khalil's jaw, sharp and jarring, teeth catching the inside of his cheek. Blood filled his mouth. He didn't stop. He wrapped his arm around the man's neck and twisted hard, dragging him back just far enough to slam his head twice into the floor until his resistance fell slack. But there was no time to recover. The second guard came in high, boot smashing into Khalil's shoulder as he rose, sending him sprawling back into the wall. The pain jolted down his spine, and before he could regain balance, a baton came whipping toward his ribs. He blocked with his forearm and felt the snap ripple down through bone. His body flared with heat, instinct overriding hesitation. He surged forward, caught the man's wrist mid-swing, and drove his knee up between the guard's legs, lifting him off the ground, then twisted, using the man's own weight to hurl him headfirst into the opposite wall. The third guard advanced toward Jasmine, reaching for her with one hand while drawing a blade with the other. But she was faster than he expected. Even without her hands free, she pivoted on her heel and drove her knee directly into the man's gut, knocking the wind from him. She turned her shoulder and slammed him back against the wall, using every ounce of leverage she could manage. Khalil lunged across the space and brought the heel of his boot down on the man's ankle, snapping it sideways. The guard collapsed, howling. Jasmine leaned against the wall, panting hard. "You good?" he asked quickly, checking her hands. "Cut me loose," she said. He retrieved the blade from the unconscious guard's belt and sliced through the restraints, her wrists falling free at last. They moved again, breathless, bodies aching. Ahead, the corridor curved toward the lower exit stairwell. If they could make it there, they could reach the ground level, disappear into the forest before backup arrived. But the compound wasn't finished with them. As they pushed through the next door, a fourth figure stepped into the passage. Massive, squared shoulders, red armband tight around one bicep. It was Red. No gun, just 2 fists and a slow, deliberate walk that made Khalil freeze for half a beat. "You're not supposed to be this far," Red said, voice low, cracking like gravel beneath weight. "But I suppose that's what makes you dangerous." Khalil stepped in front of Jasmine, body aching, vision still blurred from the elbow earlier. "I'm not here for your permission," he said. "I'm here to take her home." Red didn't reply. He charged. The impact was thunder. Their bodies collided mid-stride, fists flying before either had fully adjusted stance. Red swung with raw power, wide arcs backed by mass, not finesse. Khalil absorbed the first strike to his shoulder, countered with a jab to the throat, then ducked under a right hook that grazed the top of his temple. His head rang. He saw stars. Red didn't let up. He grabbed Khalil by the vest, slammed him into the wall, and drove a punch into his ribs that bent him sideways with a choked groan. Khalil dropped low, grabbed Red's leg, and swept him off balance. They fell together, struggling in a crush of elbows and gritted breath. Red struck hard again, fist across Khalil's jaw, then again to his chest. Khalil groaned, his muscles screaming and twisted beneath the weight, finally locking an arm around Red's neck. They rolled, grunting, scraping against concrete. It was brutal. No grace, just survival. Jasmine grabbed the baton from one of the unconscious guards, raised it above her head, and brought it crashing down across Red's back once, then twice, He howled, rolled off Khalil, staggering back to his feet. His eyes met hers, wild and bloodshot. Khalil surged up with a roar, tackled him from behind, and drove his shoulder into Red's spine, slamming him face first into the wall. He didn't let go. He kept pressing, kept crushing, until Red finally collapsed to the ground with a deep, shuddering exhale. Blood streamed from Khalil's mouth. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and turned to Jasmine. "We don't have time," he said, voice raw. She nodded, helping him up, her own body shaking from exertion. Together, they pushed through the emergency stairwell, boots echoing against metal as the sound of fresh alarms echoed behind them. But the compound had thrown everything it had at them, and they were still walking. They didn't stop until they were miles from the compound, deep into the dark sprawl of forest that stretched like a jagged scar between the industrial edge of the county and the highland reservoir beyond. There was no trail, no road, only instinct and memory guiding Khalil toward an old ranger station buried at the edge of the state lines, one of the few places he trusted not to be tapped, traced, or watched. By the time they reached it, dawn was a gray smear across the horizon, and their bodies had begun to seize with exhaustion. Jasmine's wrists were swollen, Khalil's ribs burned with every breath, and both of them were streaked with dirt, blood, and sweat. Inside, it was cold and quiet. No cameras, no signals, just walls and silence. Khalil bolted the door, set a perimeter trip alarm, and leaned against the wall, catching his breath. Jasmine sat at the edge of the wooden table, her face pale, her hands trembling, as she reached into her waistband and pulled free the folded piece of paper she had hidden in her clothing, torn from one of the briefing packets she had glimpsed when they'd first tried to move her. "I need you to see this," she said softly. Her voice threaded with something he didn't immediately recognize. Grief, maybe, or something harder to carry. He stepped forward, took the paper from her hand, and unfolded it. The top corner bore the same project name he'd seen before: Operation Shadowline. Relational Asset Monitoring. But it wasn't the title that made him stop breathing. It was her name, typed neatly under a column labeled Pre-Selection Compatibility Pairing. Jasmine Reed King. Role: Catalyst. Assigned to Subject KK. Activation Threshold. Emotional Imprint. Observed Traits. Grounding. Stability. Stimulus Control. Pairing. Initiated November 2015. He read it again, then again. She hadn't spoken yet. She didn't need to. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, shoulders still, the space between them filled with too much history to rewrite. "They picked me," she whispered finally. "Long before I knew you. Maybe even before you knew me. We met, but the choices weren't really ours, were they?" Khalil stared at the paper, the breath in his chest flattening. He remembered the date, November 2015, the conference, the bookstore she wandered into, how they'd started talking about cities and displacement, and the myth of coincidence. He had always told himself it was fate, but now he wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. "I didn't know," she said. "Not until I saw this. But they knew. They built a profile around us. They put me in your path. And I fell in love with you on my own, Khalil. That part is still real. I swear to you, that part is mine." He turned from her, fingers curling around the edge of the table. The wood cracked slightly beneath the pressure. His ribs still ached. His head spun. The files, the designation, the timelines. They weren't just surveilling him. They had shaped him. There had never been an outside. There had only been the test. The door buzzed once, his private comm line, the one only two people still knew. One of them was Pierce. He answered. The screen lit with static first, then resolved into the face of a man Khalil hadn't seen in years. Older now, with hair gone gray around the temples, and a stillness in his eyes that said more than words could. "You saw the files," Pierce said. "Didn't take you long." Khalil didn't speak. Pierce leaned forward slightly. "You need to understand. This wasn't a betrayal. It was a design. You were built for this. Everything they feared about what a black man could become if he wasn't broken, they turned into a template, a warning. You were the weapon. You just thought you were the hero." Khalil's jaw tensed. "You signed off on this. I built the framework." "Yes. But when I saw what they did with it, when I realized you were never meant to come home, I tried to tear it down. You disappeared before I could warn you. I stayed long enough to collect evidence, to sabotage pieces from the inside. But I couldn't stop the rollout." Khalil's hand hovered over the screen, ready to end the call. But Jasmine placed her hand over his. "We can use this," she said. "The files, the tracking software, the names you pulled. If we bury this, they'll just build another system. But if we expose it, they'll deny everything," Khalil snapped. "They always do," she said, steady now. "But we don't need them to admit it. We need to show it. The zoning maps, the surveillance logs, the training schedules, all of it links their tactics to government funding, to land theft, to voter suppression. You wanted a reckoning. This is how we make it count." Pierce watched silently. Khalil turned back to the screen. "Can you get us access to the satellite files?" he asked. Pierce nodded. "For 24 hours, maybe less. After that, I disappear. And so should you." Khalil cut the line. Jasmine stood at his side. "You okay?" she asked. "No," he said quietly. "But I'm awake." They spent the next 10 hours underground, tucked deep into the concrete belly of a shuttered civil defense shelter built in the 60s and forgotten by everyone except the few who had once used it as a fallback position. It was the last clean space Khalil could trust. No cell signals, no drone detection, no distant hum of surveillance. Just walls thick enough to silence the past, and a screen bright enough to drag it back into the light. Jasmine worked quietly beside him, cataloging files, stitching together the data from the compound server with the zoning overlays she had once investigated alone. What had once been conspiracy theory now stood in clear structure, parcel after parcel of displaced black families, their homes flattened in the name of urban stabilization, their records marked with language that danced around legality but pointed always toward erasure. The shock of it had passed. What remained now was grim purpose. But Khalil sat still, not speaking, staring at a video file that had finished decrypting only minutes ago. Its title was simple: Test Deployment, Phase Alpha. Time-stamped 2014. Location: West Raleigh, North Carolina. He clicked play. At first, it was just drone footage, overhead views of a quiet residential block, modest homes, cracked sidewalks, kids' bikes leaning against porch rails. Then came the breach team. 6 men, moving fast, military gear, unmarked vests. Khalil's breath caught as he saw the lead figure exit the armored van. It was him. He watched himself knock down the front door of a corner house, rifle raised, voice muffled beneath the mask as he shouted commands in Arabic. Commands meant to simulate a foreign operation, a terror sweep. He remembered that mission. The intel had said the house was being used as a domestic pipeline for overseas weapons funding. It had been approved by internal security clearance. The report said minimal civilian contact, high-value assets suspected. But there had been no weapons, no operatives, only a grandmother and her teenage grandson, both detained for 48 hours before being released without charges. The block had emptied within 2 weeks. The homes were sold within 4. He clicked the next video. Detroit, then another, St. Louis, then Chicago. Every mission played out the same, carefully framed as anti-terror actions, executed with clinical force, recorded for internal analysis. He stared at the footage. Familiar neighborhoods emptied under the guise of war. He had followed orders, trusted intelligence, but now, watching it with new eyes, it wasn't just betrayal. It was replication. They hadn't used his skill. They had copied it. And every operation was a reflection of what they'd learned from him. Each neighborhood destabilized, each community scattered. Within months, developers moved in. And on the zoning maps Jasmine had built, those same neighborhoods were marked optimized. It wasn't a coincidence. It was design. And Khalil had carried it out. He pushed back from the table, the breath in his chest going shallow, the walls suddenly too close. "They used me," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Jasmine turned to him slowly, her voice gentle but clear. "They studied you, tracked your choices, anticipated your reactions, and then they deployed you where you were most effective. You weren't supposed to question it." "I didn't," he said, eyes distant. "That's the worst part. I followed the data. I believed the briefs. I trusted the threat assessments. But it was never about threats. It was about creating absence. I was the absence." Jasmine stood and walked toward him. "You weren't the only one. They had Pierce feeding them your deployment preferences, your moral thresholds. He gave them the parameters, and they ran simulations. If you flinched, they recalibrated. If you questioned something, they pulled it from your queue. They turned you into a tool by making you think you were making choices." He looked at her, jaw tight. "Then all of this, every life lost, every building cleared, became part of a machine that only ever wanted silence," she said. Khalil clenched his fists. "I destroyed my own people." "No," Jasmine said, stepping closer. "They destroyed your trust. You didn't know. But now you do. And now you fight back." He turned to the screen again and opened a folder labeled Primary Node. Asset KK. Inside were psych evaluations, video logs, heat maps of neural activity. Even his biometric response to simulated threat footage, fear, anger, hesitation, all tracked, tagged, and weaponized. They had modeled him like a weapon system. And at the center of every diagram was a phrase, Shadowline, functions only if the weapon believes it's free. He stared at it. Every mission he'd led flashing through his mind in pieces. Doors kicked, files burned, faces forgotten in the name of something he never truly understood. A low beep from the secondary terminal broke the silence. Jasmine tapped into the live feed Pierce had sent. A direct line into the main relay node of the Shadowline server architecture, mirrored through the satellite uplink. One last chance to bring it down. "We upload this to the right places. Open-source journals, zoning commissions, watchdog groups, international media, and we cross-link it to the shell corporations behind the developments. We give it weight. We don't ask them to believe us. We show them." Khalil nodded slowly, as if still catching up to a truth that no longer waited for his permission. The next 12 hours were a blur of final preparations. Khalil packed gear with the silence of a man who had done it too many times before, while Jasmine compiled the last evidence packets into mirrored uplinks. They ate quietly, reviewed the plan twice, then left under cover of darkness, abandoning the safe house for good. The truck stayed parked near the Ranger trailhead. From there, they traveled on foot, through low brush, soaked fields, and forgotten access roads, until the distant ridge finally came into view. The rain hadn't let up for hours by the time they reached the ridge above the facility, cloaking the tree line in a thick gray mist that softened every edge and swallowed each movement in a silence that worked to their advantage. From this height, Khalil could make out the structure's outline beneath the forest canopy. Low and industrial, stretched across 2 levels with a central dome surrounded by satellite towers. It didn't look like much from above, but beneath the surface, they both knew, this was where the system pulsed and fed itself, where every surveillance node, predictive model, and classified command line had been born and nurtured in the dark. It wasn't a bunker. It was a brain. Jasmine lay beside him on the wet earth, her fingers tightening around the scope of the lightweight recon rifle as she whispered wind speeds and movement intervals. She had learned fast. Her calm wasn't just practiced. It was purposeful. She had always adapted, always adjusted, and now she moved with him not as a shadow, but as a force all her own. Her voice in his ear kept his heart grounded. Below them, armed men circled the compound in deliberate loops, their patterns efficient, their radios silent. These weren't gang members in the typical sense. They were ex-military, like Cal had said. Bought, trained, embedded, and they were expecting company. Not because Khalil had been sloppy, but because Pierce wanted him to come. Shadowline wasn't designed to be dismantled in secret. It was designed to tempt the asset into burning himself alive in the process. Khalil adjusted the grip on his suppressed rifle and tapped Jasmine's arm. She nodded once, her gaze sweeping across the clearing one last time before she moved with him, fast, low, and silent, down the embankment and into the trees. They breached the perimeter at the northwest junction, bypassing the heat sensor grid with a frequency-jamming pulse that Khalil built from the same stolen tech they'd pulled from the compound. Unbeknownst to them, another figure had entered the perimeter moments earlier, moving in shadows, trailing the guards from a different angle, watching the chaos unfold, but not yet revealing his intent. The moment they passed through the invisible line, the game changed. Lights above the towers flickered red. Sirens didn't sound. Pierce didn't want a spectacle, but the guards shifted instantly, their postures snapping into alert formation, rifles drawn, voices suddenly sharp through their earpieces. The first contact came hard and close. A figure stepped from behind the generator stack and leveled his weapon. Khalil dropped low, angled his rifle, and fired once through the man's shoulder, the shot silent but devastating. The guard collapsed, and Jasmine was already moving past him, sweeping the second corner of the entry platform where another figure was drawing up his stance. She didn't wait. She slammed her elbow into his jaw, pivoted under his arm as he stumbled, and drove the butt of her rifle into his throat with a precision that stunned even Khalil for a breath. She didn't flinch. She kept moving. They reached the entry door just as the metal began to seal. Khalil hurled the pry rig into the frame, the explosion of pressure jamming the mechanism just wide enough to let them slip through. Inside, the air was colder, recycled, dry, clinical. The hum of servers pulsed through the walls. Lights buzzed overhead with the soft static of emergency power. This wasn't just a server site. It was a command post dressed like a lab. They had 15 minutes, maybe less, before the full response team dropped in. They didn't waste it. Khalil guided them through the outer corridors, weaving around glass-paneled rooms filled with processors and glowing with faint blue light. The control center lay straight ahead, elevated on a steel platform above a floor lined with fiber cables and hardened conduits. Behind the glass walls stood Pierce, flanked by two armed guards, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable as he watched them approach. "I knew you'd come," he said through the intercom, his voice flat, almost tired. "The moment I felt you slip the leash, I told them. He'll come back. He'll want to end it himself." Jasmine raised her weapon, but Khalil touched her arm. "He's not running," Khalil said. "He's trying to witness it. He wants to see what we become when there's nothing left to trust." Pierce unlocked the glass door and stepped through alone. No armor, no weapon. Just the man who had spent a decade building a lie so sophisticated it could pass for loyalty. You were my greatest proof of concept, Pierce said, walking slowly toward them. We built Shadowline around your patterns, your mercy, your grief, your fire. We studied your hesitation like scripture. We gave it purpose. And you gave us obedience. Khalil stepped forward, fists clenched. You didn't give me purpose, he said. You stole it, Pierce smiled faintly. You gave it freely. The silence broke with gunfire. The guards flanked from the right, rifles up. Khalil dropped behind the console, dragging Jasmine with him as bullets tore through the screens above them. The room filled with smoke and alarms. They moved without hesitation, Khalil vaulting the left side, disarming the first attacker with a brutal twist that shattered bone, then slamming his head into the wall hard enough to leave a dent. Jasmine rolled low and swept the other's legs from beneath him, firing once into the armored vest before driving her knee into his neck. Pierce tried to run, but Khalil was faster. He caught him just as he reached the rear corridor, slamming him against the wall so hard the man gasped, then driving a fist into his ribs with such force that he dropped to the floor in a heap. You don't get to disappear, Khalil growled. You get to answer. Jasmine activated the broadcast module on the central terminal. It blinked red, then green, then live. Cameras came online. Screens across the country would soon see the truth. The console lights flickered green as the encrypted upload began to pulse across public servers. Jasmine worked fast, fingers flying over the interface, decrypting the final layer of metadata that would verify the entire Shadowline archive. Every manipulated mission, every classified memo, every falsified surveillance file Pierce had signed or scrubbed. The satellite uplink blinked in confirmation. It was live. Somewhere out there, people were watching. Inside the tech facility, the silence thickened. Not with calm, but with the kind of charged weight that comes before an explosion. The broadcast timer ticked down in the corner of the screen, each second pulling their names deeper into the spotlight, unraveling years of constructed silence. Khalil stood behind her, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the upper perimeter of the chamber. He could feel the shift before it came, as if the walls themselves had begun to brace against what was approaching. A dull impact echoed from the northern corridor, a vibration rather than a sound, followed by another and then a third. Closer now, the rhythm deliberate and heavy. Khalil turned his head slightly as a shadow broke from the far side of the glass-walled hallway, wide-shouldered and limping, but steady. Red moved through the frame of emergency light like something unbothered by pain, his jacket soaked through with rain and blood. His eyes locked onto Khalil's with a look not of rage, but of grim necessity. Two guards followed closely behind him, both armed and braced for conflict, but Red lifted his hand without looking back, signaling them to hold. He didn't speak. He just walked forward. Jasmine rose from the terminal without hesitation, her posture upright, weapon in hand, eyes never leaving the advancing figure. Khalil stepped forward, intercepting the distance between them before the hallway closed too tightly for movement. He said nothing. Red didn't need words either. Their history had already been written in blood and silence, and what followed would not be resolved by debate or explanation. Red let the rifle strapped across his chest drop to the floor with a hollow clang that echoed off the walls. There was no warning and no opening statement. He came forward with fists raised. The first hit cracked against Khalil's forearm as he blocked high, the second catching him in the ribs hard enough to force a breathless grunt from his chest. He returned with a short left hook that caught Red across the temple, staggering him for half a breath before the man straightened again and closed the gap with a brutal knee to Khalil's side. The pain shot up his spine like lightning, but he held the line, dropped low, and slammed his shoulder into Red's chest, driving him backward into the wall. The impact was loud, sharp, unforgiving. Red brought his elbow down onto Khalil's back, once, then again, and twisted out of the hold, slamming his forearm into Khalil's jaw with enough force to split skin. Blood pooled quickly, warm and thick, but Khalil stayed upright, his muscles burning, eyes sharp despite the ringing in his ears. He pivoted on his heel, ducked the next swing, and drove his fist into Red's stomach, then hooked his leg behind Red's knee and dropped him hard onto the steel floor. They crashed together, bodies rolling, locked in a tangle of fists, knees, and instinct. Every move Red made was calculated with the precision of someone who had studied violence up close, not in theory, but in survival. And every move, Khalil countered, came from a place older than memory. Training etched into bone, every strike tied to lessons bought in blood. He absorbed the hits. He gave them back. There was no grace left, only grit. Red caught him across the mouth again, dazing him for a heartbeat, then scrambled to his feet and reached for a blade strapped beneath his coat. Khalil saw the glint and surged upward, tackling him into the nearest server column, fists driving into the man's ribs in rapid succession until the knife clattered to the ground. Red retaliated with a brutal headbutt, staggering Khalil backward, then lunged again, this time with nothing held back. But before he could close the distance, another shot cracked through the air. Loud, close, final. Red staggered. A second shot rang out. Then he fell. Behind him stood Cal, bloodied, bruised, his shirt soaked with sweat and smoke, one hand trembling as he lowered the pistol that had once been aimed at Khalil. His face was pale, lips slightly parted, but his eyes stayed fixed on Red's motionless body. For a moment, no one spoke. "I followed orders because I believed they made me strong," Cal said slowly, his voice barely audible over the soft whir of the servers around them. But this was never strength. It was just obedience dressed as purpose. Khalil wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, his chest still heaving, ribs aching with each breath. "You made a choice," he said, voice hoarse. Cal nodded once. "And I'll have to live with it." Jasmine returned to the console. The final file finished uploading. The broadcast was secure, mirrored across networks Khalil had once used to track insurgents, but now used to expose the truth behind the very system he'd unknowingly served. Across the country, data poured into screens: Pierce's memos, the surveillance maps, the forged mission briefs, and video of Khalil's deployments in peaceful neighborhoods under anti-terror pretense. Audio logs played with Pierce's voice, speaking calmly about manipulating a soldier into believing he was righteous when he was merely effective. The world watched. Khalil stepped to Jasmine's side and took her hand. She met his eyes without a word, and for the first time in days, neither of them had to ask what came next. The machine was breaking. Its creators were exposed, and the silence that had been engineered so carefully for so long was now replaced with something louder. Undeniable truth. "It's done," she said. He didn't hesitate. "No, it's finally begun." Evidence poured through every major news outlet, whistleblower network, and encrypted journal across the globe. Files replicated faster than they could be deleted, mirrored on blockchain nodes and dark web forums, each containing the unmistakable blueprint of Shadowline. Names, dates, recorded orders, forged signatures, biometric records, and digital trails tracing directly back to DARPA and its private contracting arms. Shadowline was no longer a rumor or a ghost story told in bitter silence between soldiers who couldn't sleep. It was data. It was footage. It was voice and blood and paperwork, with government headers that no spin doctor could bury beneath jargon. every attempt to downplay the leak was undercut by the sheer volume and precision of what had been made public. Too many files. Too many eyes. Too many threads converging on the same undeniable truth. Black communities across the country had been targeted under the cover of national defense, cleared out under the banner of anti-terror protocols, and replaced by redevelopment contracts backed by the same hands pulling military strings. DARPA fell under immediate investigation, though its higher ranks offered the same denials Khalil had heard 1,000 times before. Rogue actors. Compartmentalized decisions. Outdated policies. Congressional hearings convened within days. Lawmakers stumbled over their own outrage, claiming ignorance while scrambling to contain the spread. At least 2 senators were implicated directly in Shadowline's funding chain. Others distanced themselves publicly, while quietly seeking damage control. Behind closed doors, Khalil was contacted 3 times in 72 hours. The first came as a formal offer from a defense intelligence intermediary: full immunity, private relocation, and long-term protection in exchange for one thing: silence. He didn't answer. The second arrived in the form of a sealed document, requiring no court appearance, no statement to the press. Just his signature. They called it a security measure. He called it a muzzle. The third came with 2 men in a black SUV sitting outside the cabin he and Jasmine had relocated to temporarily, their posture too still, their engine running but unmoving. Khalil watched them from the porch for 10 minutes before walking straight toward them. He never raised his voice, never showed a weapon. But they left, and they did not return. He never signed. "I didn't survive this to stay quiet," he told Jasmine that night. Silence was the weapon they trusted most. "That's why it ends with us." She had nodded, her face calm but lit with something deeper, a resolve that had not faded even after the bruises did. And in the weeks that followed, she channeled every inch of her strength into something neither of them had been sure they would live to build. The Phoenix Signal Foundation launched within 30 days. Not a protest, not a statement, a system. Quiet, focused. Staffed with data analysts, trauma-informed counselors, and legal researchers, many of them former intelligence professionals who had once served the machine they were now dismantling piece by piece. Their mission was simple: track the buried projects, expose the broken chains of command, support the survivors. What began with whispers quickly became a network. Operatives who thought they were alone began to come forward. Men and women who had been embedded, programmed, and deployed under compartmentalized missions designed to leave no trace. Some carried guilt they couldn't name. Others remembered flashes that didn't line up with the reports they were forced to sign. The Foundation gave them a place to speak, to remember, to fight. Jasmine led it all with a steady hand and a sharp mind, her voice clear whenever reporters asked why she wasn't afraid. "Because we already lived through it," she would say. "Everything after is just cleanup." As for Khalil, he didn't vanish into retirement or drift off-grid like so many expected. He didn't return to old roles or pick up a badge of activism either. He stayed in motion, working as a quiet advisor to teams that needed structure and intelligence they could trust. No titles, no uniforms. Just a man who knew what it meant to lose your identity to someone else's war, and how to help others build their own out of the wreckage. There were still scars. He carried them in the way he walked, in the pauses between certain conversations, in the long silences where he measured people not by what they said, but by what they didn't. He never spoke Pierce's name again. He didn't need to. The system Pierce helped design had been exposed. His legacy buried under the weight of truth, broadcast, and irreversible data. Red's body was never claimed. No family, No record beyond the aliases and burner contracts tied to paramilitary enforcement agencies. Cal, on the other hand, disappeared into his own version of penance. He never sought praise or public forgiveness. But the Foundation sometimes received anonymous drops of intel, clean, surgical, and damaging to the people who still tried to move in Shadowline's image. They never confirmed it was him. They didn't need to. On the anniversary of the first breach, the night they took the facility and opened the floodgates, Khalil and Jasmine stood beneath a sky free of drones or satellites, overlooking the new site of the Foundation's permanent headquarters. A repurposed observatory on public land, open to the community, built with funds from settlements that poured in after the government began paying damages to the displaced. It wasn't justice in full, but it was a beginning. Khalil looked to the horizon as Jasmine leaned into his side. "They said we were designed to break," she murmured. "They were wrong," he replied, his arm tightening around her. Together, they stood in the quiet, not hiding, not hunted, just standing, free. In the weeks following the broadcast, the small town that had once served as a quiet staging ground for Project Shadowline became a nexus of national scrutiny. The quaint, orderly neighborhoods, once held together by silence and fear, were suddenly filled with media vans, civil rights investigators, and federal agents walking door to door with warrants and questions. The gang that had taken Jasmine, the same network that had hidden behind redevelopment boards, volunteer committees, and small business alliances, began to crumble the moment the footage hit daylight. Arrests happened in waves. Some members tried to run, scattering across state lines or attempting to erase themselves in the way cowards always did when truth caught up. But it didn't matter. The evidence was too clear, the faces too visible. Their tattoos matched, their names were cross-verified through seized files, and their voices, arrogant and unfiltered, had been recorded in the very compound they once believed no one would ever breach. Within a month, over a dozen known affiliates were in custody. Several of them turned on each other within days, trying to lessen their sentences. The deals didn't save them. Others, officials and officers who had helped cover tracks and reroute complaints, resigned before charges could be filed. They called it early retirement or personal health reasons, but the town knew better. They had been the gatekeepers of a system that treated human lives like data points, and now they were being swept out with the wreckage they helped create. The sheriff who had brushed off Khalil's questions the night Jasmine was taken was removed within a week. A civil oversight board replaced the county review committee. The redevelopment grants that once flowed through secret contracts were frozen. Federal oversight crept into places no one had wanted it before. And yet, for some, it was still not enough. Because for every arrest, every article, every headline proclaiming justice, there was still the memory of what had been done. Khalil walked through the wreckage in silence days after the final takedown. The compound had been torn apart by investigators, server racks dismantled, walls stripped for evidence, bloodstains mapped and photographed. But it was more than just a crime scene. It was a graveyard of trust. And as he stepped over broken glass and shattered consoles, he realized that no amount of exposure could ever restore what had been lost in the name of control. He didn't speak much after it ended, not because he was broken, but because too much had finally been named, and putting it back into words would have felt like covering it up again. Jasmine understood. She always had. They didn't go back to their old house. It had been ransacked by the gang during the height of the operation, their photos torn from the walls, their furniture trashed in what investigators called an intimidation sweep. But Khalil didn't keep anything fragile there anymore. Their real home wasn't the structure. It was each other. They bought land at the edge of the county, just far enough to be outside the reach of city zoning, but close enough to see the rooftops in the distance when the sun hit just right. There, They began to rebuild, slowly, deliberately, on their terms. No cameras, no surveillance. Just open sky, solid ground, and peace that had been earned, not granted. Jasmine continued her work with the Phoenix Signal Foundation, its reach growing faster than either of them expected. What began as a support system for manipulated operatives expanded into legal advocacy, political reform proposals, and even a series of congressional testimonies. Her name became known, not as a victim, but as a strategist, someone who had seen the machine from the inside and chosen to fight it anyway. Khalil, for his part, kept his distance from the spotlight. He worked behind the scenes when needed, training those who needed to know how to move, how to hide, how to endure. But mostly, he stayed out of sight. Not because he feared what might come next, but because he had spent too long being watched. Now, he chose where his presence mattered, and more often than not, it mattered most to the people whose stories had never made it into files. The ones who didn't need a mission, only a second chance. The town changed, slowly, uneasily, but it changed. For the first time in decades, community forums were no longer performative. New leaders emerged, not polished, not politically safe, but honest. People spoke openly about the generational pain that had been masked by the illusion of order. Black families that had once been pushed to the edges of the map began returning. Property once marked for seizure was reclaimed. The old fear still lingered in places, in glances, in questions not yet asked, but the silence was broken. And with that, healing had room to begin. Khalil never called himself a hero. Heroes had the luxury of clean endings. He was something else entirely. He was a man who had been built to serve a lie, and had chosen, instead, to destroy it. And though the cost had been steep, blood, memory, innocence, and the last pieces of who he thought he had been, it was a price he would pay again if it meant no one else would have to. One evening, as the wind moved slow across the field outside their new home, Khalil stood with Jasmine on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. There was no talk of missions or strategy, no debriefs, no alarms, only quiet, only breath, only freedom. And this time, it belonged to them. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.